Okay, so we started the 8th chapter, and his first subject is free will, and he's opposing free will to what the astrologers say. I mentioned this last time, but I just want to make sure that it's clear. There are at least two different ways to imagine interfering with free will. One is fatalism, which means there's some power which determines for a person before he's born everything that's going to happen to him, including everything he will do. The whole life story is already written in stone before he's married, before he's born. That undermines free will full force, because it's already determined what's going to happen. And as Rambam puts it, nothing else can happen. So if you ask a person, or you try to evaluate a person, or you try to react to a person in terms of what he did, especially if you're going to condemn him or penalize him, he can say to you, you know very well that I couldn't have done anything else. You don't penalize a person when he has no choices. Usually when you penalize a person, what you say to him is, why did you do A? You should have done B. If you can't say you should have done B, it seems unreasonable to criticize him for doing A. He'll say, what else should I have done? So fate definitely undermines that entirely. Again, and that's why I said yesterday, fate is predetermination, and the PRE at the beginning is very important. Why is it important? Because that distinguishes it from determinism. Determinism, so as I know, I'm not a scholar of the ancient world, but I'm not aware that in the ancient world anybody had the idea of determinism. Determinism says that whatever happens has an immediate cause that makes it happen. But that's not decreed on a person from before he is born. It's not decreed. And it can take various forms depending upon the circumstances that lead up to the time of choice. In particular, one second. Let me say it a little bit differently. The line of reasoning that the Rambam makes, what difference does it make what you learn? What difference does it make if you put a fence on your roof? If it's decreed that so-and-so shall fall, he's going to fall, with a fence or without a fence. It can't make any difference. If it's decreed that you're going to be a carpenter, why do you need to go to school and invest in learning carpentry? It's decreed. It's got to happen. It's got to happen, and it'll happen. Whether you go to school or you don't go to school, everything is determined, is decreed before you're born. So it means that when we look at the world and say, well, A happened, and B happened, and A made B happen, according to this picture, that's not correct. A didn't have to happen. A could have disappeared. No, B is going to happen. It'll fall from the sky. B is determined because it was so fated before you were born. Determinism says what you do now is caused by what happened yesterday, let's say. But if yesterday had been different, today would have been different. Fatalism denies that. You could have a world war yesterday. He's going to be a carpenter today, because it was fated that he'll be a carpenter today. Whatever happened yesterday has nothing to do with it. Each thing is fated in and of itself. From the point of determinism, what happened yesterday has a big effect on what happened today. Because Had yesterday been different, today would have been different. Would have been caused, but something else would have been caused. Now, if you spin out determinism, you can make it come out to have similar effects to, but it's not the same thing because of this argument. This argument applies only against fate. It doesn't apply against determinism. Determinism doesn't say local causes make no difference. They make a difference. So that's why I'm distinguishing it, because if you try to push determinism in here, Rambam's arguments aren't going to work. As I say, he explicitly says he's arguing with the astrologers. The astrologers didn't believe in mechanical determinism of the world. They believe the stars create facts that rule the world. And so that's what he's fighting with, because those are the people who had views that contradict what the Torah says. The discussion with determinism would be a slightly different discussion. I'm not going to go into it. And then he says, if you believe that it's fated, so then you get as I just said, the meaninglessness of means and ends, because if the end is fated, it'll happen without the means. You get the injustice of judging people for what they do. And here the Rambam says it equally for good and bad. In the Mishnah Torah, he says it a little differently. Like with reward and punishment. To punish someone for what he did when he couldn't have done otherwise is unjust. And it's unjust in straightforward moral terms, because even in our world where we believe in free will, but sometimes what a person does isn't free, or what happens to him, or emotions he goes through aren't free, and then we excuse him, because we say he didn't do it. He didn't make it happen. He wasn't in control of the outcome. So there, he doesn't treat reward and punishment equally. Here he says both reward and punishment for what a person does will be unjust if he has no free will. There he says punishment and reward. He puts punishment first. And I think the reason is because they are not equally moral failures. Punishing someone who has no free will versus rewarding someone who has no free will aren't equal failures. Punishing someone who has no free will is unjust. Rewarding someone who has no free will is like giving him a free gift. Nothing wrong with giving people free gifts. Nothing unjust about giving people free gifts, or immoral about giving people free gifts. But it's not reward. Reward, by definition, is something you earned. This he didn't earn because he has no free will. But they're not equally morally objectionable. The person didn't have free will, and he did what he did, and you're giving him a free gift. Nothing wrong with that. It's just not morally required. So in the sense of moral action, they're both equally morally incompetent. But one's incompetence is positively unjust, and the other's incompetence isn't positively unjust. But if you don't believe in free will, you make a mockery of both reward and punishment. Punishment because it would be unjust, and reward because it wouldn't be earned, it wouldn't be reward. And since the Torah is very detailed in its description of reward and punishment, it means the Torah absolutely rejects this idea that there's no free will. And the same we said for moral judgment, let alone rewarding and punishing people, interacting with them, but just judging them. There are good people and bad people, generous people and stingy people, kind people and vicious people, and one of each pair is good, the other each pair is bad. Those judgments, if people can't act any other way than they act, are completely incompetent judgments. Would you say that the mud in the landslide was vicious and criminal because it injured people? You probably wouldn't. And you wouldn't say the same thing with animals either. When the lion chases the gazelle and kills it and eats it, you don't think of the lion as cruel or unjust or dangerous or damaging. It's just doing what it has to do. So free will, with lack of free will, would deprive us of all moral judgment and evaluation. And Torah sources are full of moral judgment and evaluation. This means that the Torah sources reject what the astrologers say. By the way, the Rambam and elsewhere says you can tell the difference between astrology and prophecy, because prophecy must be absolutely accurate in every detail. And astrologers sometimes get things right, but they also quite often make mistakes. And it doesn't affect their reputations, because people are overwhelmed by their emotions. There was a famous astrologer in America named Jean Dixon, and she had columns in hundreds of newspapers, if not thousands. And she made a prediction when Richard Nixon was president, and he was under fire, warring with the Supreme Court and all the rest, that he's going to survive this attack and is going to be a stronger president afterwards. I thought to myself, wow, here we go. A detailed, immediate prediction. Let's see how this one works. And of course, as you know, he resigned, so it didn't come true. She kept her articles, she kept her columns in the newspapers, but that's the difference. Even if they get some things right, they definitely think something's wrong. And then they have tricks. They cast their predictions in such vague terms that you can interpret them as you like. And one study did this in detail. There are the horoscope, the constellation of stars that you're born under, and that's supposed to predict what kind of person you'll be. And they have character traits that are associated with each constellation sign. So they did a study. They sent out to, I don't know how many thousands of people, what is your constellation sign, and does the description of character under the constellation sign fit your character? And they wrote out, back then a sizable percentage says yes it does. I was going to say it's 70%. And then they tried the parallel experiment. They just varied the descriptions for the constellations. They mixed them up. They sent it out, and they got the same results. So you see, it had nothing to do with getting something objectively right. People interpret what they hear to fit themselves so as to be able to give a positive result, and it's, Okay, so that's it. So far, the Rambam says, now the matter is, as I have told you, that the behavior of a human being are within his control. They're given over to his hand. If he decides, and he does, or if he doesn't decide, if he decides he'll do, and if he won't decide he won't do, without any necessity forcing him what to do. And as I said, those words leave room for influence, because we do recognize influence. And therefore, he's obligated by commandments. And that's why it says in Sefer Dvarim, behold, I have placed before you this day the life and good, and death and evil. And you shall choose life. That's what the verse says. Now, if you weren't capable of making free choices, that verse would be a mockery. It's telling you to do something which you're constitutionally incapable of doing. So clearly the verse is ruling out this idea that there is, this supernatural power that determines what you do. And therefore, he's liable for punishment if he rebels, and the reward of good if he obeys the commandment. And that's the verses that we have in Kriyat Shema, If you listen to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, and do it if you don't do it. And he's required, he's obligated to learn. Well, the word in Hebrew is funny here. To teach others and to learn. As the verse says, you shall learn them. You should teach them to your children. And you shall learn them and preserve them, to do them. Because once God gives a command, that command is something that's binding. That's binding on everybody. And if you are faithful to God's authority, it's not just enough that you follow the rules yourself. You see these rules as objectively binding. And that includes, and here he says, teaching. Teaching others and learning yourself what the rules are. He's not talking here, and here he's not talking about compelling. But you take responsibility that it should be done. Not just deciding that this is my life path. It's a very big difference. The existentialist philosopher in the middle of the 20th century, Albert Camus, made this point very clear in two of his novels. And he wrote very moving novels, and his exposition of his philosophy in his novels is sometimes clearer than when he writes his real philosophy. He wrote, more than I'm going to mention, but he wrote two novels. One is The Stranger, and the other is The Plague. In The Stranger, this fellow's on the beach, and somebody kicks sand in his face, and he kills him with no emotion and no. He's sort of drifting, and then there's a trial, and they convict him because he didn't cry at his mother's funeral, if I remember correctly. So he's drifting through life. It's like a little Kafkaesque. Drifting through life, has no direction. Things happen to him, but he doesn't do things. He's a stranger to the fact that he's a stranger to the world. He's a stranger to life. He's just like sort of drifting through, like a piece of wood riding on a wave. It's not going anywhere. It's just being pulled along by the wave. So that's the existentialist dilemma. Nothing means anything. Nothing has any value. Nothing has any direction. Everything's random. And there's nothing to do. The solution is the plague. In the plague, a city is affected by the plague, and there's a quarantine. And the chief characters in the story are a local doctor who lives in the city, and a reporter who is trapped there by the quarantine, doesn't live there, and he has a friend in another city, and he wants to break the quarantine to go to his friend. And they discuss back and forth philosophically. And at a certain point, the reporter says to the doctor, "You're working with the dying people dying of the plague, and you're trying to save their lives. And you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to sneak out. I'm going to risk spreading the plague to other places. You must hate me." And the doctor says, "No, I don't hate you." Now, I don't remember the exact words that Camus put in the novel, but the message was this: I save people because that's what I am. I'm a savior. I'm someone who helps people live. That's my life. You have a different life. And maybe your life is to see your friend in the other city and to spread the plague. That's your life. I don't judge your life. I just live my life. So Camus is very sharp here. Does the doctor value life? No, he does not. Because if he valued life, he'd lock up the reporter. No, the doctor values his life-saving activities. That's what he values. Life-saving activities are activities that I choose to do. But they're not valuable. They're just how I live my life. That's as far as an existentialist can go in acknowledging value. He can acknowledge something as valuable for his life, but not beyond that. No such thing as objective value. Right? Here, the Rambam is saying that because the command of the Creator is objectively binding, you can't simply content yourself to say, I'm following the rules. Because when somebody else follows the rules, You see that as a tragedy. You see that as a crime. You see that as unjust. Acknowledging objective value automatically puts you in a position where you judge other people. So you can't pretend to this pseudo-democratic relativism, everybody chooses his own life, and also recognize value. If you recognize value, then it's going to be value for everybody, and then you're obligated by your own commitments to take steps to interfere with other people's lives. Yeah.
How do we reconcile this with the mitzvah to judge everybody favorably?
I'll say it. I just want to say, this is where you see this brutally in contemporary discussions is the bumper sticker, which you have in some states, which is, if you don't like abortions, don't have one. Yeah, but you see, it's not that I don't like abortions, and I also don't like chocolate ice cream. They're just things that I don't happen to like. I understand that abortion is murder. And because it's murder, I have an obligation to stop it. You're pretending that, of course, the only rational attitude towards abortion is either liking it or not liking it, like you taste an ice cream, but that's a pretense that belies the discussion at issue. When you recognize something as an absolute value, like, for example, your freedom to campaign in favor of abortions, if I interfere with you, you don't simply say, well, you like interfering and I don't like interfering, and each person has his life. No, you're very upset when I interfere. And you want laws passed to stop you from interfering. Why? It's just different people with different... So anyway, Rambam says here, once you recognize that God's authority is real, then you are obligated not only to follow the rules yourself, but to teach them to other people as well, because you care about the social circumstances, not just your own. Now, judging people favorably this is really very, very interesting. The Mishnah in Prakim does say, "Have dance called Adam Mechafschus," judge people favorably. But if you take a look at Maimonides' commentary there, you'll see that what it means is far more reasonable than you may have thought. First of all, when do you have a case which needs judgment? Judge a person favorably. Am I supposed to deny my eyes? I saw him light a match on Shabbos. No, it wasn't he. It was a non-Jewish actor dressed up like him. Or it wasn't really a match. It was just a puff of smoke. Was rubbed onto the stick. It wasn't really burning. Or I hallucinated it. Or I was dreaming. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Deny what my eyes see? No. Well, then am I supposed to forget the laws that I know? I know the Torah forbids igniting fires on Shabbos. So where does judgment come into play where you're being told, judge each person favorably? Judgment comes into play where what you see is ambiguous. It might be interpreted in one of two different ways. A way that's favorable, a way that's unfavorable. I'm standing in a city street, and in the intersection, I see a guy who pulls a gun. And he shoots down the street, which is blocked by the buildings. I can't see it. And then when I come to the intersection, I look down the street, I see somebody lying on the ground, dead of a gunshot wound. What did I see? Did I see murder? Or maybe I saw self-defense. Maybe the other guy pulled the gun first, or menaced him in some way. And self-defense. I didn't see it. All I saw was him shoot. I see him dead on the ground. So here's an event that's ambiguous. So that's the kind of event where I'm making a judgment. If I judge that it was murder rather than self-defense, I'm making a judgment. Okay. But then the Rambam says, still, that's a judgment. Are we telling you that in every case of every ambiguous observation, you should judge it favorably? No, we're not, says the Rambam. That's not what the Mishnah is doing. Because if the guy holding the gun is a well-known murderer, then it's wrong to judge him favorably. Because you have overwhelming evidence that it isn't favorable. Because he's the kind of guy who kills other people when they're innocent. And you should follow your information that you have that he's a murderer, and that in this case, most likely, he actually committed murder, and you can judge him unfavorably. On the other hand, if the person that is holding the gun is someone who's known to have a sterling character, a sterling record, and never harmed anybody, and so forth and so on, now listen carefully. The Mishnah is not telling you to judge him favorably either, because you don't need the Mishnah to tell you to judge him favorably. If you didn't have the Mishnah, you would judge him favorably, because you know his character, you know his behavior, you know his background, you know his history. Logic would tell you to judge him favorably. So the Mishnah is not talking about that either. So what is the Mishnah talking about? The Mishnah is talking about an ambiguous observation for an ambiguous person. The person has some good characteristics and some bad characteristics, sometimes he's successful, sometimes he's unsuccessful. He's capable of doing the right thing, he's also capable of doing the wrong thing. So you have an ambiguous observation for an ambiguous person. There, the Mishnah says, judge favorably. So first of all, obviously the Mishnah was much more reasonable than you might have thought.
Yeah.
And it's not going to interfere with what we're talking about, because we're talking about cases where you have enough information to judge on your own. Yeah.
So is the Mishnah trying to say that if it's a 50-50 case, you should lean in the favor of being favorable to this person who's in this ambiguous situation?
That's right.
Okay.
You should judge him favorably, and then, of course, you should try to get more information. But in the meantime, you give him, as we call it, the benefit of the doubt. It's just that not everybody gets the benefit of the doubt, because not everybody has the same background of information that we know in order to make our judgment. Okay, so now he says, and now of course you recognize the relevance of the preparations, learning a trade or putting up a fence to protect people, because these things aren't determined whether the person will fall or won't fall. So what you do can actually make a difference in the outcome. Oh, he does bring it here. The business of maybe he'll die in the war, but he just says it in 3 words. There he spells it. I didn't remember that it was in here. That you tell people to go back from the war, because if you well, I say engaged, it's not really right halakhically, but you started the marriage process and didn't finish it, and if you don't go back, maybe you'll die in the war and somebody else will marry her. So go back and make sure that you marry her. That shows you that different outcomes are possible. And therefore it's important to take precautions. And various other mitzvahs which show that your actions have effect. And there are many of them. And you have also the idea of this in the language of the prophets. Now, he says, if you look at the sages, they sometimes say things which seem to cast doubt on what I've been telling you. I'll explain to you now, says the Rambam, how to understand them. And here you have the famous one which says, Hakol b'dei Shemayim chutz b'yirah Shemayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for the awe and fear of heaven. What will be included in the everything? Well, if you're talking about other than human behavior, maybe that's not so serious a challenge. We mentioned this before, but let's spell it out a little bit more detail. If we're going to exempt human behavior from this dictum, so then what is going to be in the hands of heaven? Well, your physical condition, your environment, your resources, to a certain extent, your mental and emotional condition, the resources that of your society that you're born into, and those are the resources that you have available to you. Those things could be in the hands of heaven. But that doesn't interfere with your free will at all. Now, it may determine, at least in part, the choices available to you, but that doesn't deprive you of your ability to make choices. It just determines the alternatives available to you. And that's not the kind of undermining of free will that we're concerned with here. Here, we're concerned with taking away the ability to make choices. Let's take an extreme example. Someone puts a gun to a Jew's head and says, bow to the idol, or I kill you. Has the person with the gun robbed the Jew of his free will?
No.
Certainly not, because this has happened many thousands of times in history. Sometimes it's a gun or a knife or bow and arrow. And the person either decides to bow or decides to resist and die. And there have been many people who have done each of them. And there's no reason to think the person, there may be cases where it's not a free choice, the person just frees and loses ability. That could happen. Fear can freeze a person. That can happen, but it's no guarantee to happen every time. And especially for those who chose to die. So all that does is change the alternatives available to you. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about threats to free will. Threats to free will is where you either become or have been a robot, and there are no choices ever available to you. And so now, where's the threat going to become? Well, let's see. We started by saying that everything's in the hands of heaven, exempting human behavior. But now the statement says, except for the fear of God. You might think a lot of human behavior isn't about the fear of God. Well, what about that? Is that in God's hands also? Wheaties or Cheerios for breakfast. I'm going to become a doctor. I'm going to become an accountant. I'm going to move to Chicago. Not obvious that the fear of God is involved in any of those choices. Does it mean that all human behavior other than investing in the fear of God also is in the hands of heaven? Well, intuitively, that's going to undermine a great deal of what we think of as our free choices. So then there's going to be an attack on the actual ability to make choices. So there are two ways to go here. Either you say, yeah, that's true, but it doesn't matter, because all that matters is choices about fear of God, which would be very extreme. Or we're not understanding what Chazal are telling us. So let's see how the Rambam takes it. But, he says, in the language of the sages, is their statement that I just read to you. And, of course, what they say is true. No challenging this. Well, I'm not going with that. And he says it intends to convey what we have said. But many make the mistake and think that some of our actions that really, in fact, are free, this dictate says are not. For example, marrying someone. Well, I'm getting married, that's my choice. And marry this one or marry that one, that's my choice. Nothing there about fearing God, fearing heaven. It's just people get married, they set up families, and so forth and so on. And now the sages are telling me I didn't have free choice in who I married. Because everything's in the hands of heaven other than the fear of heaven. So then, the Rambam is saying, they're going to conclude who you marry is something which is dictated to you from heaven. And he's saying it's not true. Why not? Or earning a certain piece of money, inheriting an estate, or acquiring an estate, or receiving a gift and having money that you didn't have before. Maybe fear of heaven is involved in what I do with the money. But having the money and not having the money, that's not my fear of heaven. And therefore, it would be something of which I have no control. My actions aren't my actions. I'm dictated. And he says, this is not true. Because, he says, think of marriage. Marriage is a mitzvah. You contract marriage with kedushin, which is a particular legal process which creates a new personal status for the two of them, and you have to write a contract which describes you as the husband's obligations to the woman you marry, and she is permitted to have relations with him and no one else. And his purpose in marrying her should be to raise a family, and that's a mitzvah. So what do you mean that Hashem is not involved, or the fear of heaven is not involved in getting married and who you choose? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not decree that you should do a mitzvah because that's part of your fear of heaven. So since getting married is a mitzvah and involves other mitzvahs, it's not under the decree of heaven. So therefore it's got to be included under the fear and awe of God, and therefore it is under your control. And it is your free will. And especially, let's suppose that in the marriage itself there's a crime. Then the choice to marry and not to marry is the choice whether to commit a crime or not. She may be some kind of relative, close or distant, and it may be forbidden by Jewish law to marry her. And certainly, marrying her or not marrying her is the choice to commit a crime or not to commit a crime. That's a moral choice. That's a spiritual choice. That certainly expresses your fear of heaven. And then what about having this money? Well, how did you get the money? Were you honest in your dealings? Did you steal it? Did you lie? Did you fabricate? Did you misrepresent? Earning a living is full of mitzvahs. And therefore, the decisions you make in earning a living are going to be expressions of fear of heaven. And if you would, finishing the point, if you would say that Kadosh Baruch Hu decreed that Reuben should have this field, then, since in fact he got it, let's say, through committing crimes, it would be that Kadosh Baruch Hu decreed that he should commit those crimes, and that's just not true. Rather, the truth is that all of the actions of a person are given over to his own power, his own free will. Because of the wide application of obedience and rebellion against the Torah's requirements. So now, there is this encourages a reflection, which I think is really very, very important. I mentioned this, I can't remember what I say in which year, but I mentioned this not too long ago, that the attitude of many people is religion is important, and there are other important things also. And don't become a one-dimensional person, and don't let religion take over your life, let academics take over your life, and don't let aesthetics take over your life, and don't let sport take over your life. Recognize that life has different features and different dimensions, and so lead a balanced and full participation in a variety of features. It gives your life variety, it gives your life different types of stimulation, right? If that were true, then in all those other areas, according to this dictum of the Talmud, there wouldn't be any free will. But what the Rambam is pointing out is that everything that you do has a religious side, has a religious dimension. And therefore, the Chovos HaLevavos says the same thing. It says if you go deeply into it, the normal idea that there are three possibilities: something is obligatory, or it's forbidden, or it's neutral. It's what we call in Hebrew reshus. You have the choice of doing it or not, because it doesn't have any significant characteristics, is a mistake. Everything is either obligatory or forbidden. Now he says that, but it doesn't spell out in detail how to do it. But I'll give you an example of how this might work to expand your horizons a little bit. I have a free Sunday afternoon. What do I mean free? There's nobody in the hospital that I have to visit, and I've paid up my debts, and I'm up to date with the work that I have to do, and my relationships are all good and in order. There's nothing bearing down on me, nothing. So my choices are mountain climbing or playing chess. 2 friends are available. I can choose whichever I prefer, whichever I feel like doing. It's a free choice with no consequences. But here's what's being left out when you look at it that way: that the actions that I perform have effects even on myself. When I perform an action that reinforces certain parts of my character and deteriorates other parts of my character. And if I ask which of the 2 choices, mountain climbing or chess, is more appropriate for my character development, then there may very well be a determining factor which would make one better than the other. Better in terms of my moral and spiritual development, and therefore something which would come under the fear of heaven. So, for example, suppose I have a trait of laziness. I just don't like to make strenuous physical effort. And I know that there are times when there are certain mitzvahs that I really should do, but they're so hard, I don't get to do them. Then maybe mountain climbing is the right choice for me. Because in that way I'll increase my endurance and my tolerance for physical effort, and I'll do more mitzvahs. Or let's suppose that I'm an overly competitive person, and when I win a chess game, I gloat, and I make the other person feel like dirt. You really messed it up. You've heard somebody talk like that, haven't you? It's getting a lot of press nowadays. And that would make playing chess a wrong decision for me. Or maybe I'm mentally lazy. I'm physically very active. I play basketball, right? But I'm mentally very lazy. And although I don't really like chess because I don't like the mental effort, it would be good for me because I need, like the Rambam says, to prepare my mind for reasoning, and that would be an important thing to do. So the effects of your actions are much broader than you might think, and therefore the implications for your Yiras HaShamayim are much broader than you might think. So when the dictum of the sages says everything's in the hands of heavens except for your fear and awe of heaven, maybe that covers much more ground than you thought. It's strictly true, but it covers much more ground than you thought, and it really reinforces your free will for the normal gamut of your life rather than threatening it. That's one way to avoid the clash between that statement and the commitment to free will. Yes, I have.
Couldn't you? That could come through in every decision you make. Because if you're having breakfast and it's a decision between fruit and sugary cereal, now you're thinking, well, I don't know my body. It's a borrowed body. I need to choose the healthier option because I need to return it, to the ground in the healthiest state. So now suddenly your choice is affected by
100% right, and I think that's what the Chovos Levovos really means. He means that if you look more deeply into the consequences of the decisions you're making, you'll find out that there's no such thing as reshus. There's no such thing as simply take it or leave it. It's up to you. It's either obligatory or it's forbidden. Yeah. Especially, I think you're putting it well. The words that I used, obligatory, forbidden, are absolute terms. But let's suppose that you have a pair of alternatives, A and B, and A is better than B. But if A is better than B, and those are your only 2 alternatives, and you have the ability to do A, then you ought to do A. You don't have moral permission to simply do the less ideal action. Now, I know this runs a risk of supererogation, and I'm aware of what that means in ethics. But there is a position that supererogation is a mistake. That if something really is better and there's no other difference between the two, then and you just ignore the better one and choose the worse one, there's a moral failure there. So then I think you're right. That's where the Chazal is going. That if you go deeply enough into the implications and effects of the choices you're making, you find that all of them are have moral character. This also affects something that bothered me for a long time. Well, I'll tell you what bothered me. It doesn't fit in exactly rightly with what bothered me. I had students tell me free will only applies between a choice between good and bad. All other choices aren't free. Now, I have a certain idea of free will philosophically, and this thought challenged my idea. So I said, listen, if you can show me a source where it says that, I'll junk the philosophy and think things through again. But if you don't show me a source, I'm not going to accept it because my philosophical understanding tells me that it's not like that. I made that challenge to people for 20 years or more. No one ever showed me a source. But I found the source. There's an essay called Mamar al Ikorim, the essay on fundamentals, which is printed at the back of some of the editions of the Derech Hashem, written by the Ramchal, and in it he says it word for word. If you're not choosing between good and evil, your choice is no different from the choice of a mouse. It's totally dictated by heaven. So I said, okay, there goes my philosophy, out the window, and I have to think things through in a different way. But then I thought, how much of life is left? And then this observation became more important for me. Because it comes out, what we're saying now is that almost every decision you make is a decision between good and evil. But here's the difference. What you pointed out, what I'm confirming, is that there are better and worse aspects to the choice. It doesn't follow that I'm aware of the better and worse aspects of the choice. I might not be aware of that. So now, according to the Chovos Levavos, what happens in the case where there are better and worse aspects, but I'm not aware of it? I think there he would say that since I'm not choosing between good and evil, I'm choosing between A and B. Just so happens that A is good and B is evil, but I don't know that. So I'm not making a moral choice. I'm making a trivial choice which has moral implications. There I think he would say that I'm functioning like a mouse, not like a human being. It's where I'm facing the choice to do good versus the choice to do evil, that's when free will is given to me. And the fact that externally and objectively there's a moral difference won't project it. So that won't save for me the expanse of free will that I used to believe in. Anyway, that's, I think, where the Rambam is dealing with this problem. Yeah.
Somebody doesn't make any of these choices with your Shemone without how is he punished for his actions? If a person only has control over things he does with the Shemone, no, but he just doesn't have any Shemone.
Well, that's an interesting question. Maybe I'm hearing it probably a little differently from the way you mean it. Yirah Shamayim, fear and awe for heaven, is a mitzvah. So he ought to be doing that mitzvah. He ought to be working on doing that mitzvah. And if he's working in doing that mitzvah, then these are decisions about Yirah Shamayim. But you might ask about a person who's just an atheist living his life. Now, I don't know whether, when the Ramchal says, decision between, see, we're now mixing two sources. Whether the Ramchal says, choice between good and evil, when the Rambam was talking about Yirah Shamayim. But it could be that when the Rambam was talking about Yirah Shamayim, he's not talking about thinking about Yirah Shamayim. It's things that Yirah Shamayim requires. It's the field of Yirah Shamayim, which would include good and evil. What you really should, to make the question sharp, the question should be asked about someone who doesn't have the categories of good and evil. He just does what he does. Like the existentialists claimed that there's no such thing as good and evil. There isn't. There isn't. That's just what you do. And you can have your own commitments, and your own identity, but that's not good and evil in the world. That's just, what you choose to do. Then, according to what we are saying, this person's really a mouse. He doesn't have any free will. Now, just to end the discussion, Camus, like many philosophers, was guilty of an out-and-out contradiction. Because having said that there's no real value, no real good and evil, no real justice, and so forth and so on, he said, but there's one crime. And the crime is not facing the truth.
Sure.
What he called mauvaise foi, bad faith. Bad faith is a crime. Really? Gee, I thought your position was there aren't any crimes. But he felt so importantly about facing the truth which of course philosophy reveals, and he's the philosopher who reveals it, so it's of course completely objective, no subjectivity there at all. Same thing with Aristotle, who said the highest human activity is thinking, and the highest human thoughts are philosophy, and I'm a philosopher, and it's just an accident that I came to that conclusion, right? The Mussar greats would have a lot of fun with these people, their pretense to objectivity. Anyway, so even he recognized in the end. I don't think he acknowledged this as a contradiction, but it is a contradiction. Okay, so that's how the Rambam so far is going to handle this problem. We'll pick it up again tomorrow in the session.
Thank you.